Diaz at his home in Hastings on Farragut Avenue, and this is June 29th, 1988. Jerry, would you mind telling me a bit about yourself, such as where and when you were born?
Well, I was born in New York City on May 9th, 1918, and today, being 1988, I just turned 70 in June. In May, not June, May. Right.
Okay.
We came up from New York City to a new house. This house was built it was finished in March of 1921, and that's when we came up to Hastings. Now, my dad used to work for Flo Ziegfeld in the Winter Garden in New York City, and he used to bicycle up here to see where his boss lived. And he found this piece of property here, so he thought he'd buy it and build a house, which he finally did in 1921. And that's how I came up to Hastings.
And you lived in this house ever since?
Ever since. And I came up in Flo Ziegfeld's Rolls Royce. Because he told Flo Ziegfeld that he built the house over here, and he was moving up, and Flo Ziegfeld said, "How are you going to get that child up to Hastings?" He says, "Oh, we'll come up by train." And Flo said, "No, you won't." He said, "We'll send a car for you." So he did. He sent his Rolls Royce over, and that's how I came to Hastings.
He did. That's great. Let's see. Jerry, did you work on the Hastings waterfront?
Well, you mean in my job?
Yes, in your job.
Well, I worked in the Anaconda Wire and Cable for 33 years. I started there in 1941 when I started there. I worked in the old reel shop. That's where I started, which was right on the waterfront.
When you started working for Anaconda, what were the other companies that were on the waterfront?
Well, there was the Hastings Pavement Company was right between the Anaconda, the North Mill, and the South Mill, and that was the only one up in that area. And down in the southern end was Zinsser's, Zinsser Chemical Company, and that was the only really the only two companies that were down there at the time.
I see.
Or rather, the three companies really: the Zinsser's, Anaconda, and the Hastings Pavement Company.
How would you describe the waterfront at the time you were working for it, the state of the factories and so on?
They were just about, well, not the way they are now, but they weren't very well kept. The Anaconda was well kept, but the Zinsser's was rather, it was an old company, and there was small buildings all over the place and sort of nondescript buildings. And actually, being a chemical company, some of it was real dirty. And the chemicals, mostly they were purple chemicals all the time. I belonged to the yacht club, and the first time I rode down there to look at it, I had borrowed a rowboat, and I rode down there, and I looked, and I thought I was seeing things, and I see some purple rats. I couldn't believe it. And these rats running through the dyes, it seemed it was more purple than anything else. And they were all colored, the rats. It was orangey colored and different colored rats because they ran through the dyes. And that's how that chemical company was.
Is that what they produced, was dyes?
Yeah, mostly dyes, yes. I never went in there very much. There was no opportunity to go in there, and they didn't allow visitors very much. Some people got in there. A lot of people walked through there somehow or other, but I never was really interested in looking at it too much. But working right next door to it later on, years later, I could see it all the time because I worked down there for a couple of years right near the mill itself.
Now, what did you do in your job?
Well, I had various jobs. I first started in the reel shop, and we made reels. And then I sort of gravitated a little bit towards the carpenters. And when they needed someone else, I used to help with the carpentry work, putting railings in, or fixing a room or something that needed carpentry work. But then I sort of worked my way up, and I got into the test department. And I did work in the test department, and I got into Navy sampling. and to cut samples of cable and send it down to the Navy Yard in Brooklyn, and they would test it down there and approve it for the going into ships, because that was just before the war.
Well, this was cable that was put into the ships.
Yeah, this was all types of cable. They made, of course, they made the minesweeping cable, and mostly general lighting cable was a big item, and control cables. Oh, I could remember names: DHFA3, MHFA44, MHFF44. I can remember all the names of them. And no, they were all designation of cables. When they had higher numbers, usually it meant that they were multiple cables. If they had anything up to the 44s and the 37s, and they were all multiple cables, and they went in for direct control of the guns. And then they had a heavier cable, like I remember the SHFA 500. That was a heavy cable. That was for magnetic mines. They used to put it on degaussing cables. It was put around the ships, and they put a high current through them for the mines, not minesweeping, to prevent the mines from going off when it went over. They called it degaussing cable. And in fact, I remember I got into the service in 1942, 43. I went into the service, and one of our cables, I was on a destroyer, and one of the cables broke, and it was the main control cable for the director. And it was why I remember that MHFA 44 that I mentioned before, or FF 44, was a very flexible cable, and it goes from the director on the top of the ship down to the bottom in the control section for controlling the guns. The cable from twisting back and around with the director, the cable broke. They twisted, and the cable had been made wrong. They had put a tape in it that wasn't supposed to be in there, and it got caught in the flexible cable, and it snapped all the cables. And I went on the USS Marquette to find a piece of cable, and I found a piece of Anaconda cable, which I had them cut off, and 57 feet, and I installed it on the destroyer. And I swore that the Anaconda cable was the best, that we should use it.
That's great. Well, let's see. Well, after the how long were you in the service?
3.5 years, and then I came back to the Anaconda.
Mm-hmm. And what did you do when you returned from the service?
Well, when I came back into the from the service, there wasn't. There were a lot of people that had the jobs that we had before, and they found a place for you. And I got into the physical test department, which was a little different. And we tested all sorts of cables, anything that was made in there. And I was stayed in there till, 1950, I guess it was. And then I moved up to the research laboratory. And that was an entirely different system where it was the research laboratory was a part of the main company, and our office actually was down in Wall Street, and they rented space, and we did work for Anaconda, all of Anaconda, not only the mill here, but whatever needed to be done throughout the company, research work, inventions, whatnot. You could do almost anything in the daytime. There'd be all different kind of jobs. You never knew what you were going to work on. And we tried to serve the company in any way we could. If there was a problem, we'd be sent out on the problem, check what it was, and then figure out what was wrong with it. And we try and solve the problem. And it actually was not entirely separate from the company. It was actually the Anaconda Wire, not Anaconda Wire and Cable, the Anaconda company.
Well, Jerry, how did your job? Did you work on the production line at all?
Well, when no, I never worked really on production. Well, in a way, I did when I was in the inspection department. We would have to go out and inspect in the mill, But I worked most of the time. I never had a steady job out in the mill on production, except if someone was out or missing. I would go out and do the inspection that whoever was out, because we had actually there was two people in the inspection department at the time who had been in for quite a number of years, who could do any job in the mill, and I was fortunate enough that I was able to do every job in the inspection department in the whole mill. So I would travel from the north mill to the south mill to the wherever I was needed. They could put me out and do the inspection. So I was able to do almost any job in the mill. So I got pretty well covered the mill very well. I could go to any department and know what was going on and know what they needed, what the production was in the mill in that particular part, and how to inspect it and see that it was done properly.
I see. Was your job dangerous in any way?
Well, not particularly dangerous, except walk around and you might be run over by a truck or something rather. Like we had one fellow one time, he was walking through, and it was a cold day, and they had pipes, steam pipes all over the place, and they'd bang when they heated up in the morning, and there was half circles in the place, or for expansion joints. And one morning, boy, they were banging and whatnot, and a bolt fell out from one of these inspection places and hit the guy right on the head. It really floored him.
Were you ever injured yourself on your job?
Not particularly. Yeah, only once I was injured. I had a still. I used to have to use distilled water for tests, and they put this brand new still up, and they forgot to bolt it to the wall. And I'm trying to put the water in the test receptacles, and I pulled on the hose, and the still tipped over, and the hot water fell on my head and burnt my head and face and on my chest. But that was something that was, an accident that happens.
Yeah. Was that accident covered by any medical insurance or workers' compensation?
It was by compensation. But luckily, they took care of it down there, and the Doc Cessalini was down there. He did a great job on my head, especially. It was pretty well burned up, and I had no scars from it at all. Oh, one other time I was careless, and I found I had a cable with 30,000 volts that was live in my hand. And that was a little hairy for a moment, but I just closed my eyes, and I grounded it on a water pipe, which shook the building when it hit when the breakers went off, and actually brought everyone up to the room where I was to see what happened. But nothing happened. It just short-circuited, and then the breakers went, and so it killed the 30,000 volts, which was fortunate. But things like that could happen in a mill very, very easily. I remember one time in the test department, there was a little fellow named Eddie DeBrini. He was sort of short, and he was always hiding somewhere so he wouldn't have to do any work. And he crouched down behind one of the reels in the test department, and he's sharpening his knife there to get the next job done. And the test fella closed the gates and put the voltage on, and I don't know, there's probably 100,000 volts went on there or something like that. And all of a sudden, Eddie DeBrini stood up, and he had enough sense not to move, but he heard all the buzzing of all the wires. So he stood up very straight, put his hands up in the air, and shook his hands. And Stagliano was the fellow from Dobbs Ferry. He saw the hands shaking down there. His hands weren't only shaking, he was really shaking too. And he hit the button and killed all the voltage. But that could have been a serious accident, couldn't it?
Yeah, certainly so.
Yeah, but things like that did happen. Periodically things had happened. But I think the safety record down there was pretty good. They stressed safety pretty much. We had safety men all over the place, and it was pretty safe to work there.
Was there any premium or bonus pay for special jobs you might have done? Or?
Yeah, there was. I wasn't on it most of the time, but they had production work, and they had a bonus if they. Whatever they were working on, especially on the wire drawing machines, if they drew a certain number of feet more than, or they made a certain number of reels, they would be paid a bonus on it. And then there was premium pay for the 4 to 12 and the 12 to 8 shift. But most of my work wasn't on the day shift. I wasn't too much on the bonus system at all.
But it was the plant was working around the clock?
Yeah, the plant worked around the clock. Yeah. One of the places where they really worked around the clock was the tank room, where they impregnated the cables with oil. And that had to go around the clock. And that worked Saturdays and Sundays, because once they put a reel in to impregnate it, if it took 3 days to do the job, whether it was Saturday, Sunday, or Monday, it had to continue. They couldn't shut it down.
What was the oil penetrating? Was there a wrapping of
Paper. Most of these cables, they were high voltage cables, and they had 200 or 300 layers of paper on there. And first they would evacuate the paper to dry it. By putting vacuum on it, it would suck all the water out of it, all the moisture out of it, and after a certain length of time, that paper would assume to be dry. Then they would heat it up to like 100 degrees, and then put oil in it, cable oil, and they'd leave it for a certain length of time, and the paper would become impregnated with the oil, and that would be the insulation. And that was one of the big things in the research laboratory. We were trying to work with cable. We were trying to get the cable up that would be so well insulated we could have a smaller cable. And that was the work of it. And one of the big jobs that they did in the research lab, they developed a cable to use from the Con Edison nuclear plant down to Dunwoody, where it goes underground. And the cable up here was on the lines all from the nuclear plant down to Dunwoody is Anaconda Cable. It's a aluminum cable with what do you call it? Galvanized cable in the middle, steel cable in the middle, with aluminum cable on the outside, and they use that for the lightness. And it's a 375 volt cable, and then it goes down to the plant at Dunwoody, right by the center there, the shopping center, and it goes underground. And that was the cable that also developed for the Anaconda, the 375 oil-filled cable, which goes down to the distribution plant in New York, and it's cut down to the voltage required to the rest of the place in New York.
You know, these cable products that Anaconda made here, where are they being made today? In this country?
I don't know where they're made. I think all the cable that all the machines, I believe, were sent overseas to Korea and Japan, I believe. And all the machines, I think, were taken out here and sent somewhere else. I don't know where they're being made.
Did you have to wear any special uniform or special equipment on your job?
Well, certain places had to have uniforms. They had in one place where they impregnated some cable, they had a compound on it that was sort of dangerous. They called it haloax, and that used to raise hob with some of the fellas, especially where it was rubbed on the wrists and on the neck. And they supplied them with coveralls and gear to prevent it from getting onto their clothes. And of course, the regular safety gear, you know, the helmets and goggles that you do on any job, any production job that has to be done. It was supplied by the company. It was pretty safe for those things.
In around 1950 or so, how many people were working at Anaconda here?
I think it's somewhere around 500 people. It varied. In the cable business, had its ups and downs. You see, like in the winter time, around Christmas time, there always seemed to be a big layoff, and they would lay off a lot of people. Then as it came along the springtime, and they would hire people again, and I guess one time there was, I believe there was around 2,000 people during the war, somewhere in that area, and then it dropped down, and it was nominally about 500 people later on.
How did you hear about the the job you started with at Anaconda?
Well, we call it the ABC college down there. It used to be the American Brass Company, and it was a joke all the time. You worked down the ABC college, and how I got into it. I guess it was about. There was in 1940 or so. There was a Navy inspector that used to live in town, and so he spoke for me down there, and then I went down to see Jim O'Neill. Everyone remembers Jim O'Neill. He was the hiring man down there. He worked there, a local man who worked there for years, and I went down to see him, and that was the way it started. I had been going to school, but I didn't want to go anymore. Various things happened, and so and Dad was sick at the time, and I had to have the job to help out, and at least I thought I did anyway. So I figured I'd start here and then go to school nights.
And did you?
I did for a while, yes.
Yeah. Did you generally enjoy the work you did over the years?
Yeah, the work was it was enjoyable at times, and it wasn't very hard. Especially when I got into the research lab, then it became very interesting because it was a challenge. We worked on different inventions and whatnot, and I was able to come up with some pretty good ideas. So, and there was no, there was supervision, all right, but I mean, no one ever pressed you, never even, and it wasn't like a production job where you had to work day in, day out, do the same thing. Every day was something different. And maybe you'd worked for 6 months on a job, well, I had a job that was ongoing, it must have been ongoing for about 5 years, but not a continuous. It was testing every once in a while. This stuff would run for all by itself, and you would check it every once in a while. But most of the time, you wouldn't work on the job for very long. Once you solved the problem, you would work on something else.
How many people were working in the research department there?
There was about 25 people.
Mm-hmm.
They were almost all engineers, or had engineering background of some sorts, and most of them were fairly talented people who could do almost anything at all.
What would you say was the toughest part of the job you held over the years?
I don't think there were any tough jobs. No, the jobs down there were almost even the tough jobs. There were some hard jobs where in the rod mill, that was a tough job, and it was a dangerous job.
What did they do in the rod mill?
Well, they got copper ingots came in from Jersey, and they brought them up, and they had 2 tugs that used to bring barges up and bring them up, and they used to offload them here and then put them into the rod mill, and they had furnaces there. They had 2 furnaces, and they used to heat them up so that they were red hot. I don't know what the temperature was, but then they put them into the mill and into the rollers, and then the rollers would hit them into like squares, long squares. Then they go into rollers, and then the fellas had to grab them with these long rollers would squeeze it into a spaghetti form almost. First it was a heavy rod, and then they would put it into a roller and lengthen it out like spaghetti almost, and they would really roll it out into rods, and then they coil it up. And these rods were probably 200-300 feet long, depending on the size of them. Like if you had a rod that was a half-inch rod, it wouldn't be very long. But if you had a 1/4-inch rod, you would have 200-300 feet of copper rod. And then those rods were brought after they were rolled in the mill, in the rod mill, they would be brought over to the main mill, and they would be welded together, and they were drawn into machines, and they would make all sorts of rods, wire that would be drawn into wire, anywhere from like they had half-inch rod, 1/4-inch rod, and then they had down to fine wire, which was 0063. So you can imagine a cable, a wire made out of rod, say a 200 or 300 feet of quarter-inch rod, that would be drawn down into a machine that would draw it down to the size of a hair. The smallest cable, the smallest wire they made was 0063, and I don't know how many feet would go into that. I suppose I knew at one time, but right now I wouldn't remember how long it would be. So it was a continuous process. Like the wire, they bring the rods over, and they'd weld them all together, and they'd put them on these carriages, and one coil on top of another, and that would go into a machine, and they would put dies in it, and they'd have a number of dies, anywhere 5, 7, 12 dies, and it would draw it down from, say if you're doing quarter-inch rod, it'd draw it down from quarter-inch, it'd make it a little bit smaller for the first die, smaller to the next die, till it came down to, the smallest in the first drawing, the first set of drawing, it would be like a number 8 wire, 185. That was one of the small wires. And then from the 185, they would put that in another machine further on down in the line, and that would be made into finer wire.
Jerry, what about the weather or the seasons? Did they affect the working conditions at the plant?
Well, they sure did, especially in the rod mill. In the rod mill, those rods, they came out, they were red hot when they came out, and they would limit the time these fellas could work in the pits. They call it a pits. They had several pits down there, and this red hot cable comes snaking out on a steel platform. They'd have to grab it and sort of whip it around them and put it in the die on the other side. So the temperature was terrific down there. They would get soaking wet down in the summertime. It was terrific working in there, and so they had to limit the time which they could work. And the fellow working on the ovens, they were really hot also. So they would limit it pretty well in there. Then there was the other part of the cable where they made the weatherproof cable on the street lighting cable. They had this tar that they used to dip the cables in. And used to have to run. That used to be red hot too, like tar. Not red hot, boiling hot. And that would have to limit the amount of time they could work near those things. And actually, they had to limit themselves because that was really hot and hard work now. And we didn't have air conditioning when we first started down there. There was no air conditioning whatsoever. And they were really hot, especially in the drawing machines. And when they had to put these bobbins, they could run anywhere up to 600 pounds. They had to take them off the machines and put other bobbins on. They really were hot. And the machines working down there were hot. And this copper dust would get around. They would, everyone, their undershirts would be green from the copper sulfate.
Gee, maybe we ought to stop this side.
Spot in the mill, of course, was the tank room where we spoke before of them heating the cable to impregnate the hot oil. And they had a couple of tanks that after they impregnated the cable, they took take the oil out to get the reels out, and they used to pump it in these tanks. And those tanks were pretty large tanks. These cables were, the tanks, they were about 10 feet tall and probably about 10, 15 feet across. So you can imagine they held a lot of oil. And naturally this oil was 100 degrees. They used to let it cool a bit and then they pump it out. And this tank would emanate all this heat. So if you were anywhere in the tank room, anywhere near those tanks, it was really hot in there. In fact, they moved the testing pot one time right on another part of the building that we had been. We had these nice open windows on the other side. When we moved up it was on the second floor really, and it was right opposite these tanks. The tanks were just across the wall from where we were. So the physical test department got hot from these tanks. I remember one time that actually the temperature in the room was 98 degrees and I came home because it was so hot. And all we had was fans. We had no air conditioning at the time. So there were hot spots in the mill and there were cool spots. There were a lot of nice spots in the mill. Some of them working near the water and they were beautiful too. But right there, the Hudson River, beautiful view. And,
yeah.
But they were few and far between. Of course, in the wintertime, the first day that I started down there, I didn't know what I was going to do, and I wound up pitching lumber into the reel shop. And the day I started, it felt like it was about 10 below. So I was working outside without proper clothes on, which I didn't know where I was going to work. All I was regular work clothes and thin clothes, really, because I thought I was going to work inside. And here I'm working outside and it's cold. And I after about 10 o'clock, I went inside and told the foreman that it was just too cold to work out there. He didn't believe it till he stuck his nose out and he says, "All right, come on in and work in here." So there were cold spots.
Tell me about your co-workers there. Were they from Hastings, or what about women workers and any black workers there at the time?
Well, in the beginning, there were always a few women workers. They worked in not knitting mills. He worked on the Wardwell machines. They made the cable, the wire for the lighting companies, for the street lighting wire. At that time, they had to put a covering over the wire. There was no insulation on the wire. They put 3 layers of cotton and they impregnated with asphalt. And everyone thought it was insulation, but it was no more insulation than anything. It was just to cover a situation. Like if you see down the railroad tracks, you'll see plain copper wire because they have the right of way or they own the property. So you don't have to cover the wire. But in towns and villages, they had to have an insulation on, not an insulation, a covering on the wire. And everyone thinks it's insulation. But it wasn't at that time. It was just cotton-covered wire. And there was a fellow from Dobbs Ferry who invented the Duraline wire for the Anaconda Wire and Cable. And a fellow by the name of Olson. And he saved the company thousands, more than thousands of dollars. Instead of using 3 layers of cotton and then impregnating it, he put 2 layers of paper, and it was sort of folded over the wire with just 1 layer of cotton over the top to hold it together. And then they impregnated it, and they called it Duraline. And that was a great invention because it saved the company a lot of... It was easier to do because you didn't need the cotton. You didn't use much cotton. The paper was a heck of a lot cheaper than the cotton, and it was easier to make. And what came along suddenly, though, later on, back in about 1967, I guess, polyethylene came into effect. And that was a godsend to the cable companies, because now they could use polyethylene, and they had 1 dye, and they could put thousands of feet of cable, and they had no weaving to do, and put a lot of people out of work because they could make it much cheaper and easier. But all the women used to work on these machines using the cotton and braiding the wire over the cotton because the job needed someone with quick hands, and it was sort of a monotonous job more or less, and it seemed that the women seemed to be very well fitted for that job. They could watch the machines, and they had a quick eye on when they saw a broken cotton on it. They would spot it right away. They were good on doing that cable. But the polyethylene really did away with that. And they were always, there were Negroes on the job. There was a few. I remember one old fellow who'd worked down there for years and years. But they had quite a mixed gang down there. They had Polish and Russian workers. That's what the town was built on, really. And they ran most of the machines that they had down, especially the wire machines. And the rod mill, too. A lot of them down on the rod mill.
Did most of the people working there live in Hastings?
No, not entirely. There were from all over, a lot from Yonkers. And they came from, I know one person, I know a couple of them came down from Croton every day, from the Bronx, from across the river, Nyack. Some came across from Nyack, and there was really quite a conglomeration of workers down there.
Did many of them arrive on the train for work?
Yeah, they came from. They used the train, all sorts of transportation, and I guess later on in the year, naturally, all went to automobiles and buses. But most of the workers, I remember when I first started, there was a lot of people coming up on trains. But later on, I guess it was a lot easier to come up by car, just like every place else.
How would you judge the working conditions there and the company? Tough, fair? Or?
Well, in the beginning, I guess you would say it was sort of tough, just like everywhere else, where they had to do their work. You know, you couldn't hide down there. Everything was sort of open, and it was actually it was an old mill where they had the some of the foremen were up on one side of the mill was a long platform, and the offices were on one side, so they could just look out of the windows and they could oversee the whole plant. So there was really no place to hide, and if you weren't doing your job, they could just look down on you and see it. And they had some conditions. We had a couple people down there who were really not. I would not get along with them.
The supervisors, you mean?
Yeah, more than supervisors. I can remember one time, there was no smoking in the mill, but there's always a place to smoke. But I remember going in the men's room one time, and there were a couple of people smoking in the men's room, and we had one of the big wheels down there. Every morning they had an inspection. They'd walk around and see what was going on in the mill, what was bad, what was good. Of course, you never heard what was good. You always heard what was bad. And he came into the men's room and he saw the smoke rising above the stall. So what did he do? But he put his hands on the door and lifted himself over the door, looked in the stall, and said, "You're fired," because he was smoking while he was in the men's room.
Hardly fair.
Hardly fair. That's right. And there were two other people there that were smoking, and they were just standing there smoking. He fired them as he came in, told them, go get your time. And there was a fellow with a pad and pencil, and they did that. Now, to finish the story, how the conditions could be, the next day, some of the maintenance men went through the whole mill and took all the locks off the stalls in the men's room, so that he could see if anyone was smoking while they were in the men's room. And that was really a sore spot for me, because after I got up and met these people, I didn't get along with them very well, and I told them so too, unfortunately. But that's the type of conditions you would get. And I tell you another tough condition. When I first started, I worked in the as I said, in the reel shop, and sometimes it was night work. They had special jobs to do, so they had overtime. And I remember they had a night shift because they had a lot of reels to make. It was just before the war really started, but they were making cable, I guess, for Britain or whatever, and so they needed a lot of reels. So we worked a lot of overtime, and the platform of the mill was high, the whole shop was high, so they could back a truck up in. And one night I'm working and I'm putting these little tags on the reels. I always had the soft jobs. And I see the door was open in the back so we could get air in there because it was dusty, and I see these pair of eyes looking in. And pretty soon I saw the superintendent come in. He went over to the foreman and he talked to the foreman for a few minutes, and then he went out. After he left, the foreman went over, walked over to one of the workers and told him, "Go get your time." Evidently, I didn't see what he was doing, but evidently he hadn't been doing his work, but had been sitting down somewhere, and he told the foreman to fire him. And the guy went out and got his time right there. He went home at that hour at night, and he was fired. And that could happen at any time. Someone could come in and didn't like the way you were doing something and fire you.
Were these union people had been fired?
Well, we had that was a union that had started down there, and really, it was really a company union. It was run by the men, but some of the men in the union were really company men. So there was really no guarantee, but it was the start of a union. And that's the reason the unions really got hold down there, because things like that did happen. And later on, especially after the war, the unions got very strong. And I think then the pendulum swung the other way. And then they couldn't touch it, they couldn't fire anyone or do anything anymore. And the working conditions, of course, got a lot better after the war, of course. But before the war, some of the things they did then, they were pretty tough.
Did you ever incur any job-related illnesses?
No, I never. I guess I was one of the lucky ones. I never.
How about industrial accidents? Did they ever have any industrial accident that caused the plant to stop production?
I never saw any production stop, but they had accidents. But as I say, I think the work record, the safety record, was very good. If you ever reported anything out of line that you didn't like, most of the people down there, the foremen, the superintendents, they would see that it was corrected right away. Most of them, anyway, that I saw down there. I know that there were some accidents. I know one accident. There was a worker working with a jackhammer, but he wasn't wearing his rubber gloves, and he hit a live wire. Now, he should have been wearing the rubber gloves, and that was required to wear the rubber gloves, but he was killed.
Oh.
And there was another fellow had a tie on, and he shouldn't have had a tie on working around one of this was a bunching machine, and the tie got caught in the machine and sucked his head in the machine. And there were several accidents, but most of the severe accidents that I heard about or associated with any matter was mostly carelessness or something happened. But there were accidents that happened just like in any industrial plant, and especially some of the jobs down there were dangerous, and people did get hurt in the wire drawing machine. A lot of them got hurt in the wire drawing machines, and there's been fingers cut off and things like that. But those are industrial accidents, and but most of the safety things down there were pretty good. And they usually had all the equipment you really needed, and if you needed something, all you had to do was yell long enough or hard enough, and you'd get it if you could recognize it. They had safety committees down there, which worked really well.
How did you get to work?
Well, I drove down, but I could walk down too. I mean, it's only a couple minutes from here. I could walk down,
sure.
But I didn't like to walk back up again, so I took the car down.
And where did you park down there?
Well, there was a lot of places you could park. There's the Hastings had a lot of parking space, but I was fortunate enough to park inside the plant all the time. It was only a short time that I wasn't able to park inside the plant.
You mean inside of a building?
No, there's a lot of areas
on the grounds.
On the grounds.
Yeah.
And before at one time there was nothing up in the North Mill, and they used the upper part of the North Mill, and they used that. And then the parking was pretty good. Then when they started the North Mill, they made use of the North Mill again to put more machinery up. They were going to put telephone cable and whatnot up there. So then they stopped the parking up there, so a lot of people had to move on. That was the time we had to go out of there. You had another parking space, which was the old village dock. There was a section where the old pavement company was that went right to the waterfront, and that was village property. And the Anaconda traded that property for some other waterfront property down south of the Zinsser plant. So then the Anaconda took over that old village dock, and they put a covering over it, and they used to store material in there. And actually that parking space was out also, so that made a shortage of parking spaces. So they allowed some people to park all the way inside the plant. And actually everyone was looking to park inside, but they only allowed certain people inside, and all the rest had to park outside. Then they built a new new building, and there was other areas to park. And fortunately, I had a Volkswagen, so I suggested that there was about 10 spaces where they could park little cars. And then actually, I was working up in the research laboratory, and there was 2 spaces right by the door of the lab, which was excellent for small cars. So I got a space right inside the building. And so I always parked inside the plant.
Did you ever receive any awards or certificates from Anaconda?
Well, I had a couple patents that I was in on. I got those. But as awards, no.
Now, did you retire from Anaconda?
No, not actually. I didn't retire. In a way, I was too young to retire. They closed up the research lab. And there was another thing when they closed up the research lab. One Friday afternoon, they came and told us that that was the end of the research lab at 3 o'clock in the afternoon, that we had no more job for Monday morning. And I was too young to retire, so I wouldn't even have had a pension. And so that was it. Fortunately, they had a meeting of there was a vice president in charge of engineering who was quite a knowledgeable person, and he had a meeting called of the board, the Anaconda board, and they awarded a couple of us pensions, because we would have been retired without anything at all. After 33 years, you would have went out without. Well, they would have given you. Some people got 6 months or a year's pay or what. I forget just what it was, but that's all you would have gotten out of the deal.
And how old were you when this took place?
I was 50-something. No, I wasn't 50, 54, I think it was, yeah. That's right.
And so you did have a pension then?
No, I didn't have a pension. I got my pension, but I wouldn't have got it unless they had the special board.
I see.
Yeah. There was, I think there was 4 of us who were really too young to retire. We would have got nothing at all.
Yeah. Did the older people, I guess perhaps they had their pensions built up?
Yes, it wasn't that good, though. Actually, there was no golden parachutes at that time.
Did your family have a feeling of loyalty toward Anaconda?
I don't know. I don't know if they did or not. Yeah. I suppose we did have, in a way, because we had the job. We had the job down there, and when my son came home from college, he worked there for a couple of years. I got him a job down there, and they were good enough to hire people from college kids. So I guess there was a sense of loyalty in a way. Except when after they closed it up like that, we didn't feel so well about it.
I guess during most of the war, you weren't working there then.
No, I was. I was in the Pacific at that time. So.
Now you mentioned before that you were a union member down there.
Yeah. Well, for a while I was a union member up till I went up in the research lab, and that being a salary job, you had to be in the union. It was necessary that you join the union.
And when were those unions organized?
Well, they were organized. Actually, the first union there was organized in 41, I guess it was, and or 42. 42, I guess it was organized. I don't remember. That was the original union, which I say we called it a company union because they didn't do very much for us. But when I came back from the service, this was the electrical workers union, and at that time we had a lot of trouble with that union. They were communists. There was MSAC and Betty Smith and some of the others, and they made it very difficult in that they took as much money as they could from the union. They didn't do very much for us, and at that time it was a lot of flack with the communists. So they finally tossed that union out, and they joined the CIL-FIO, CIO, AFL-CIO, yeah. And that was a much better run union, in that the workers had more of a say in what they could do, what they wanted done, and you had the support. And they finally got some good leaders in in Anaconda, the union, the leaders of the Anaconda Union got in there. Oh, they were men and women who had the interests of the workers at heart more than the unions did, so the union was fairly well organized then.
What were the conditions that led to the formation of the unions?
Well, there was a lot of things that the work that the people did, how they were treated, and there was a lot of antagonism towards the higher ups in the company, I guess, in the beginning. So I told you about what happened, a few of the things. I didn't like that happening. That incensed me no end to see that happen, and I didn't like unions myself. I was not one really for unions, but when I saw things like that, I supported it because of what happened.
What about strikes while you were at Anaconda? Were there any
Oh
strikes?
yes, there was 2 strikes. There was one strike when I was actually in the union, and I don't know if we should have gone out at that time. I was not happy about them going out because I think they could have handled it better.
What year was that?
Gosh, I don't remember what year that was. That was about 1950 something, somewhere in there, somewhere in that era. And when we went back, we didn't get very much out of the whole thing. If you took the time we lost and whatnot, I don't think it was really worthwhile for us to go out on the thing. Then, after I went up in the research lab, they had another strike, and they stayed out for a long time. But they allowed us to go in, so we worked in the research lab because we were not in the union anyway, and we were part of Anaconda Company, not Anaconda Wire and Cable, so we were able to continue with our work without interruption.
But the rest of the plant activities were closed?
Everything was stopped. Yeah, everything was stopped.
How long do you think that lasted?
Oh gosh sakes, it was weeks it was going on. Was it? I don't remember, because we were working all the time, so it didn't affect us that much, and so we didn't pay too much attention to the strike, and we really had nothing to do with it anyway, so we didn't pay too much attention to it.
Was the union involved in Hastings politics, would you say?
No, I don't think they were ever really involved in Hastings politics. Not unless they were asked for something, but I can't remember them ever being in politics at all. I couldn't honestly say they were.
Would you say the village, generally speaking, supported the unions, or were they antagonistic toward them?
I don't think they were either antagonistic or supported them. It's just like in any society. Some people like unions, others don't. Some are antagonistic towards unions, and I think they were just either antagonistic or friendly towards unions just because of their own situation. But as far as the village was concerned, I don't think they were really concerned with the politics of the union itself, except maybe back in the time when it was with M. Sack and Betty Smith, and what's the other one who were they were from Jersey anyway, and they were alleged communists at the time. So I guess maybe people were antagonistic at that time because the union was supposedly communist controlled.
What year would that have been?
I was in the 50s somewhere.
As late as that?
Yeah, yeah.